My name's Richard Rouse. I'm Studio Creative Director at Farbridge. We're working on a bunch of games not announced. And my talk today is how interactive should my game story be? So I've actually been working on games for a while, and specifically a lot of games that have sort of interactive narrative components. The very first game I ever worked on, Odyssey, was sort of a Ultima 4 style RPG that at least one person in the room may remember. And then later on, I worked on The Suffering, action horror game set in a prison. It had sort of an interactive narrative morality system thing that led to branching endings. Later at Microsoft, I worked with the good people at Undead Labs on State of Decay. That was a game where you're sort of trying to survive in the zombie apocalypse, sort of a light survival game where the characters you had that you were getting to control were semi-procedurally generated and could perma-die, and then you'd have to take over other ones, so the character roster was always changing. It was very interactive in that way. And then most recently I shipped a few years ago The Church in the Darkness, a sort of experimental indie game where you're infiltrating a religious cult and trying to figure out, are the cult leaders good or bad? And that procedurally changed every time you played the game. So I've been fortunate to do this a bunch of times. I'm sort of always fascinated by how different movies depict the interactivity in games versus maybe the reality we know. You could go all the way back to like The Last Starfighter, where the kid gets really good at the arcade game, and then it turns out it's training for an intergalactic war he needs to go fight in. A favorite of mine from the 60s is Fahrenheit 451, had this weird interactive TV thing in the middle of it. I recommend checking that out. Another more recent one, Serenity, kind of not a movie I can actually recommend, but has a weird video game twist in it. If you're into finding out what that is, you could seek it out, but I did warn you, it's maybe not a perfect movie. But one of the ones people always think about when they think about this sort of thing is like The Matrix, right? 1999 classic. Neo doesn't really know he's playing a video game at first, and then it turns out he's in this simulated reality. And as he finally realizes where he is, he gains these superpowers and sort of lives out this video game power fantasy as he's going. But that's not my favorite movie from 1999 about video games. My favorite movie from 1999 about video games is called Existenz. I don't know how many people have seen Existenz. Many people? Wow. Well, sorry, you can all go. My talk is spoiled. No. So for those who haven't seen it, Existenz is a David Cronenberg movie where the video games of the future, they're not consoles in the plastic box scent, but they're sort of these fleshy organisms that live, and you jack into them with these umbilical cords that go into the base of your spine. And these games are sort of these, things that, and the movie is about this game designer called Allegra Geller, who has designed this amazing game. It's about to come out and is highly anticipated, but she's on the run from the realists. The realists think people are playing video games too much. This is bad for us. We need to kill Allegra Geller. We need to destroy Existenz. So she goes on the run with the guy called Ted Pikel here, and he's never played a game before, actually, but he's trying to save her life. So they end up, and she's like, well, actually, in that last attack, the Existenz was damaged. It's wounded, and I have to play it to find out if I can cure it or not. And to do that, I need to play it with a friend. We need to get you a bioport. So they get him a bioport, and he finally plays one of these games for the first time. And then, as he jacks in, he realizes it's this perfect, visual simulation of reality, looks perfect in every way, and he sort of like reaches out and touches things, and he's like, oh my God, this is amazing. But then he finds out that not everything is exactly like reality, as we'll see in this clip.
I have what you're looking for. Who sent you?
It's none of your business who sent us. We're here. That's all that matters. God. What happened? I didn't mean to say that.
It's your character who said it. It's kind of a schizophrenic feeling, isn't it? You'll get used to it. There are things that have to be said to advance the plot and establish the characters, and those things get said whether you want to say them or not. Don't fight it. Just go with it.
But should you be saying this in front of him?
Look at him.
What's he doing?
He's gone into a game loop. He won't come out of it until you give him a proper line of game dialogue.
This is tricky.
Start by repeating your last line. Include his name so he knows you're talking to him.
We're here, Darcy Nader. And that's all that matters.
Yes, you're right. That is all that matters.
Now, you said you have what we want. We were waiting.
So when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is amazing. They've completed this totally perfect simulation of reality that's sort of indistinguishable, except for one thing, the narrative's still on a rail. Like how did this happen? Like all this technology, they spent the entire budget on the graphics, nothing on the interactive narrative. This is a travesty. And I was very strident about this back then. I really felt like all games should really have interactive narrative in some way, and this was super important. And here I am seeing this nightmare. But you know, over time, I have calmed down a little bit about this. I've gone on to work on many other games. I've worked with many different teams and met different developers and met other players, and they all play games for different reasons. So I've become a little less strident in this belief that everything should be an interactive narrative, you know, to the nth degree. And you kind of have to figure out, well, what's the type of interactivity I need to have in my game? What's going to work for my game specifically? So this is going to be a talk about sort of going through 6 steps of figuring out how much interactivity does my game story need. We're going to start off with just, I think the first step in this is figuring out what does the player get from the interactivity? Like, what are you trying to accomplish with it? Before you even start, think about what's the player going to get out of it. And they can get a lot of different things out of it, right? You know, we often think of those perfect narrative experiences. It's like this really nice package. Everything is great. You play it once, you get to the ending, and you're happy. But a lot of players crave replayability. A lot of players want to stay in your game longer than maybe just your core quest or whatever. Or so much they want to play things like roguelikes. This is a screenshot from Hades. I'm sure everybody knows that. You know, where they sort of, you're making a roguelike where you can go on multiple runs. So to put a narrative into this, they made a narrative that fit that structure, right? They built the narrative around the replayability. And you should be thinking about that too, if that's one of your goals, having a replayable game. How is the narrative going to support that? Another thing players really crave is reactivity, right? The idea that the game is going to react to the choices they make. This is a screenshot from Fable, where in that game you would go on a pretty linear story throughout the game, but the game was just very reactive to the choices you made. What weapon were you wearing? What things had you done in the previous quest? And the NPCs would stand around and applaud or boo or whatever, depending on what you've done. And players really love that feeling of just the game is noticing me. It's seeing what I'm doing and it's commenting, and not just in like stat upgrades, but also the characters in the game. They're gonna comment on it. The game is seeing what I'm doing. Another thing players really crave is shareability. Like, you can think of streamers, right? Like, this guy went out of his way to make a video about a Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough with evil, you know, an evil alignment and having a paladin. And he was able to make a unique thing for his stream because of, you know, having something that was interactive in the game that he could play off of. And it's not just streamers who want this too, right? It's players, play games, talk about them with friends, talk about them in discussion groups. They want to say, hey, I want to share my experience, but also have something that's unique as I'm sharing it, right? So I'm not just telling you, if you're playing a game that's totally linear, you're sharing something the other player probably already knows. Another thing that, you know, going back to Baldur's Gate 3 again, self-expression. It's why you have creative players in games like this. Players want to, even if the story is fixed, being able to create your own character to take through it can be very meaningful. Similarly, with self-expression, though, you can take it to the nth degree. You can go all the way to a game that allows full self-expression, full interactivity like The Sims, and you at some point sort of stop having so much of a fixed linear narrative, but you can still have something, and obviously players love this game, and some see it as a storytelling experience. And some games, your interactivity might be the entire point of what you're making. This is a shot from Dwarf Fortress. And you know, if you go that far down that road, you're sort of, again, still, this is the whole point of what you're making, and that's fine too. Sometimes players go to that. They want something that's maximally interactive, that does all the things. So the next question you should ask yourself is, what does the player expect from the interactivity, which is a little bit different than what they get. Because they're going to come to your game with certain expectations. You know, they may come to a game with genre expectations, right? They're coming to play an RPG, and you have to decide, well, how much interactivity you're going to put in. But if you had none, you would be going against the genre expectations, right? And that's fine. Sometimes you want to do that. But you should be aware that you're doing it. How are you going to have to teach the player how you're doing things differently than the genre expectations? An RPG could be a case, or again, State of Decay is a survival game, a light survival game, where the genre expectations in a survival game where you can go a lot of different ways to figure out how you're going to survive. You need to have a narrative that supports that. You need to have something that has that space for the player to make different choices, and the game world will react to that, not only in a systems and like a game mechanics way, but also in a narrative way. Of course, again, in State of Decay, they may also be coming with player fantasy expectations. Like, players come to a game thinking, oh, this is the game where I'm going to get to do this. It's sort of sold to me as like, how are you going to survive the zombie apocalypse? What choices are you going to make? If you're selling the player on that fantasy, you need to support it with the narrative. You need to make sure there's enough sort of interactivity in there that as they make their choices about how they're going to live through that player fantasy, the game is reacting to it. And again, going back to the Church in the Darkness, the game I did, this had a lot of fantasy expectations that kind of went wrong, actually. So this game, you're infiltrating this religious cult. We sold it as like, try to figure out, are the cult leaders good or bad? But a lot of players came to the game sort of expecting, oh, I'm going to get to talk to everyone, really do detective work about it. And you can't do that, but it's also kind of an action game with stealth in it. And because of some scope reasons, a lot of the characters just run away from you, and other ones start shooting at you right away. So you're like, hey, well, this isn't really the fantasy I had. Sure, I can talk to some characters, but what are the rest of these characters? I was expecting something different. And that's something to think about when you're selling a certain player fantasy in the game, to make sure your game is living up to it and not bringing the player something they weren't expecting, or, hopefully adjust your marketing to be selling the game you're actually making. So another thing you should think about in terms of expectations is how your game sets expectations within itself, right? So if you look at this is sort of a perfectly linear story, right? Going from event to event to event, quest to quest, whatever. And let's say that we're like, hey, we should make this more interactive narratively, right? Okay, well, how can we do that? We could do that this way, right? Now it's an interactive story. It's perfect. And if you do this, this isn't very common, but you sort of set up this case where it's like, hey, I get to make this cool choice, and then I don't get to make any choices again. Like, wait, what happened to the game? So this isn't very common, but this is a little more common, right? Where you have a game that feels very linear all along the way, and then suddenly, like, surprise, multiple endings. And this can be, again, the player is learning from your own game what they're going to get, and they'll end up disappointed in the ending if it doesn't live up to what they thought were the rules of the game that were established early on. So this actually happened to us in The Suffering, where the structure of the game originally looked very much like this, where you were sort of you were doing different objectives you had along the way. You could like choose sort of good or bad things to do with each, but there wasn't a lot of feedback about it along the way, and then, oh, surprise, multiple endings at the end. So what we did was we added signposting along the way to say, hey, this thing you've done is actually a really big choice. You should be thoughtful about it. You should realize you've done it. Proceed differently in the future. So this was better, but still not quite there. So we ended up adding just enough. Again, this was an action horror game. This wasn't somewhere a person was necessarily expecting any interactivity. So we wanted to make sure there was enough to sort of show them, hey, this is the game you're getting into. This is what you can expect as you keep going. And so when you get to the end, you're like, oh, of course, I've been seeing this all along the way. So as you've established sort of the ground rules between, what do you want the player to get out of the interactivity, and what can the player expect out of the interactivity, you should start thinking about, well, what are the layers of interactivity that I care about? And there's a lot of different ones you can care about. You don't necessarily have to care about all of them to put some interactivity in the game, right? So one layer is what I call moment to moment. You can play through Fable, again, to go back to that example, where you're getting this sort of reactivity along the way to all the choices you're making. But the narrative itself is actually pretty fixed. But it still feels very reactive because in the moment you're getting all this feedback from the system. If you're interested in this sort of moment-to-moment feedback, something I recommend checking out is sports games are actually really excellent at this. The sort of play-by-play commentary you get out of systems this makes you feel very centered in what you're doing while they're talking about what I did. It feels great, even though the game's going to go 9 innings, maybe overtime. But you sort of get that feeling in a way that I think other games could learn a lot from. Those systems, like in MLB The Show here, is just super high fidelity, very well done. You also just might have moment-to-moment sort of interactions and conversations. You might have branching dialogue that doesn't need to affect the end of the game, but just might be in that moment. You're having fun, like in Monkey Island here, navigating through conversation trees, learning little bits of extra things about the characters, even though there's not like extensive branching in the story. So that's sort of the moment-to-moment layer, just what's happening right then, doesn't need to affect anything later. The next layer up, you might say, is like the quest level, right? This is an example from Fallout 3. I'm going to go on quests in Fallout 3. I'm going to get different outcomes depending on choices I make. And then that's going to feel meaningful to me because I'm going to see these little changes. Now, the interesting thing about Fallout 3 is it actually has a very linear sort of main quest structure. Sure, it has side missions all along the way that you can do. But as you go through these different quests, you're going to see these little changes, but you're going to stay on that sort of very linear rail. So it's going to feel reactive, but not actually be branching all over the place. Of course, the corollary to the quest level is you can pay this off with multiple endings, and that is something Fallout 3 did. They had this sort of beautiful wrap-up at the end. It went over all the events that you did and how everything sort of paid off for these characters that you had touched along your way in your journey through the Capital Wasteland. But then, the next evolution in layers above this then would be to actually go to multiple paths, and that's something they did in Fallout 4, where they actually had, again, those sort of linear quest structures, but then it actually forked into different paths, and you might miss whole sections of it. And this, creates an even more different experience for different players. Then you get into challenges of like, hey, can we make these all interesting to the same amount? Do we have time to do all of this content? Because then here you're going to start missing content. This is really great if you have, a pretty large team, a pretty large budget, and some cool stuff can come out of this. Is it necessarily better than what we saw in Fallout 3? Not necessarily, but again, it comes back to what are the choices you're making for your game. So the next layer I want to talk about isn't at the quest level, but just at the character level. It's sort of like forming up a party in an RPG to go through a pretty linear story with them. Hey, well, at least I'm experiencing it with different people along the way, right? So the layers, again, at this sort of character level can happen in State of Decay, where the simulation is spitting out these different characters who are sort of uniquely generated. They might die at any time. You might lose them. So you're going to have to decide, hey, who do I care enough to take with me to be the one that I play going through this story? Watch Dogs Legion did a really interesting version of this too, where you can promote these characters sort of out of the world and decide, hey, you're going to be the one in my group. We're going to go, do this together. And the narrative then in Watch Dogs Legion is very fixed, right? It's not branching all over the place. It's not changing a ton. But it's sort of, because you're doing it with these different characters, it changes enough that it's interesting, right? And they wrote these tons of variations of the scenes with which character you had. So it was actually fairly complicated, but still in a fairly linear structure. And again, if you want to go crazy, combine all the layers to, again, end up with a simulation, something like The Sims, something like Dwarf Fortress. No authored story. Feels a lot more, kind of amorphous as a story. Doesn't feel like a traditional story. Players may not say, hey, that's a story game at all. And players are doing a lot of the work here. It's really the player's story that they're telling. So you're going to be relying on them to do it, but it can be very meaningful with them. If that's your goal, you're going to want to have that, leave them in that experience where it's okay that they don't have a fixed story because they're getting this amazing simulation. So next up, once you've thought of the different layers, you can think about, well, what's the depth of the interactivity I want to go to in each of these layers? And this can be in all sorts of ways in your project. One thing I like to think about is just what I call the chatter dialogue. A lot of people call these barks. A lot of times barks kind of get a bad rap on writing teams, like the more junior person has to do that. But I like to remind everyone that, hey, this is actually the most important part of your writing in a lot of ways. The person who's the lead, maybe they get to write the cut scenes, the fancy things, but let me tell you, those things are probably going to be watched only once, right? The barks are going to be with you all the time where you're playing while you're spending time in the game. And that's why I kind of don't like the term barks. It's like, are these dogs or what are we talking about here? I prefer to feel like these are meaningful things, and hey, if the barks are bad, that's what players are going to take away from the game. And the great thing about implementing barks, is that you can tie them directly to players' actions as they're going along. And they're kind of not that hard to implement. You can just trace things that, hey, these are the things the players are doing as they're going. Let's write triggers for those. And they can get more complicated. This is an example from Homeworld Remastered, where, as you're playing an RTS, you're directing units around and things like that. You're going to want to react to the different choices you see players making. These can get simple to like, hey, I ordered my unit over there, it got into combat over there, that sort of thing. You can get it more complicated where they're reacting to like, hey, we're in a tough situation here, or we're winning here. Those things are harder to implement. You can decide if that's sort of worth it on your project. Again, with branching conversations is another example of where you can go to different levels of depth, right? So, when you think of branching conversations, it's like, particularly as you start out in the industry and you're like, hey, I'm going to write a branching conversation, you might say, wow, I'm going to make this really interactive. And you start making it. You have a starting point. You're like, hey, from there, I can say 3 things. Cool. OK, from there, I can go to these different nodes, and I can make these choices. And then, oh, I can make these. And pretty soon you realize, hey, I can't fit this on the page anymore. It's getting so large, right? And you're just having this sort of explosion of content you now have to create and manage as you're going, trying to develop your whole game. Eventually, as you think about branching conversations more, you're like, hey, some structure like this is actually better, where it feels like it loops back to things. It has choices. They don't all fork the entire tree, right? And you're able to have something that still feels very interactive this way, but is less of a burden on you to just create. And having something that still really works for the player, but doesn't crush you with the content. One way to obviously bring some without having that huge forking thing, you can also just have branching conversations that have really meaningful consequences in the sequence of events, like the Telltale games are really good at that, for example, with The Walking Dead. All right, so now that you've thought about, hey, well, these are my different layers of where I'm going to work on interactivity. Here's how deep we want to go on each of them. Remember, you don't have to go deep on all of them. There's lots of simpler ways to do things that still feel really interactive. Next, you have to sort of teach the player that your interactivity is even there. Because again, often when you're doing games that maybe users aren't used to having interactivity, they may not even know it's there. They may not know they're making these choices. And the Telltale games are really good about that, having this warning up front that says, hey, this game series adapts to the choices that you make. The story is sort of tailored to how you play, just really shining a light on this is what players can expect out of the game they're having. This was something I did, again, in The Church in the Darkness, where, this was a very different type of game for the different type of story for the game we were doing. It's action stealth game, suddenly has this weird procedural narrative layer on it. So we just wanted to be clear, hey, in this game where the motives, beliefs, and actions of the preachers, who are sort of the antagonists in the game, may be different every time you play. Just be really clear about it from the beginning. We actually did this, too. We made an endings menu right off of the main menu. You could pick the thing that said endings, and it showed you what the different endings you had unlocked were. Looking back, I don't love this menu anymore. It's sort of pretty cluttered from a UI standpoint, kind of ugly. And it kind of encourages the wrong thing, too, which is encourages like, hey, look at this thing. I've got to go, I've got to get all of these. I've got to collect all these things. And that really wasn't the intention. I really want players to get 4 or 5 endings, something like that. That gives you a pretty good sense of what the simulation is doing. But instead, some players would see this and say, I got to get them all. I love players who get into that and do that, but it wasn't really the intent there. Another interesting example of this would be like in Detroit Beyond Human. They actually went even farther, showing what was underneath the hood, when actually saying, hey, you made this choice. Well, actually, there's all these other choices you can make. Here's our tree structure. Maybe you want to look at this. And this is something that actually showed up in the game as you made choices. Again, this has a lot of sort of breaking of the suspension of disbelief, you could say, where the player is really no longer thinking about it purely as a narrative, but maybe thinking of it as a, hey, I should explore this. But it's something they did, was an interesting choice, and I think might fit for your game as well. So the interesting thing to think about as you're working on the game is you're going to, and doing all these new interactive things, you're going to need to playtest your narrative. So often in games we playtest the systems. Are players learning the controls? Are they figuring out how to play and win, right? We focus on that. We don't spend enough time playtesting the narrative. And this can be hard, obviously. So often it's hard to know, is it really working, until you get to, the whole thing has to be there to see if it's really landing. But of course, by the time the whole thing's there, you're shipping, and you can't change it that much. So try to figure out, how do I playtest some small section of it so that I see if players understand the systems we have in the narrative, so that we can see if it's really landing. All right, so this has been a quick summary of how interactive you should think your game story should be. Just to go back, you want to think about, like, what does the player get out of the experience of having an interactive? What do they expect out of it? And as you think about those things, think about what are the layers we want to do? What's the depth of the interactivity we want to do? And then finally, remember to teach the player everything you have. Remember to play test it to see if it's really working. So, but there's probably another little summary of this that we could go back to Existenz for a quick thought on just how interactive your story should be.
But you know, I do feel the urge to kill someone here.
Who?
I need to kill our waiter.
Oh. Well, that makes sense. Waiter! Waiter! When he comes over, do it. Don't hesitate.
But everything in the game is so realistic. I don't think I really could.
You won't be able to stop yourself. You might as well enjoy it.
Free will is obviously not a big factor in this little world of ours.
It's like real life. There's just enough to make it interesting.
So in the end, that's the most important answer. How interactive should my game story be? Just enough to make it interesting. Thanks. I think we're pretty low on time, but if there's a question or two, or I could talk to people after, go ahead.
Thank you for the talk, first of all. I wanted to ask specifically about point 5, the idea of teaching players about sort of the level of interactivity. And I was wondering how you sort of frame that up against like hidden choices and kind of, things that like might make, sort of reward a player for like thinking creatively about the systems. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely am a fan of hidden choices and have sort of tried to go that way maybe too much in the past. But I think if you're saying, hey, we have some choices at all, there are some choices here, then you can hide other ones without it feeling like so much of a surprise at the end or whenever the system pops up and says, oh, wait, no, that mattered, you didn't know. So definitely pro hidden choice, but just work them in with more obvious choices so the player even knows there are choices going on.
You mentioned the last point was playtest your narrative. What are your favorite methodologies for playtesting a narrative specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky, again, with the, like, how do we playtest when, the whole thing isn't done yet. I think, playtesting something like a vertical slice to see if the systems are working at all can work, where you can say, hey, we've got this chunk of it. Let's see if it's just working here. Otherwise, you often have to go to like paper sort of stuff where, someone is telling the player, telling the subjects, the research subjects, what the interactivity or what the story is going to be, and see if they would, are getting it, are into it, and that sort of stuff. And then finally do a playtest once it is all there, just to make those last-minute adjustments. But it's tricky, like I said.
I was always wondering, they sometimes have the negative karma path in games. You ever find it disturbing how many people seem not just to just pick it because it's fun, but actually go for the negative karma path as their first path?
Yeah, I mean, what I've found is usually players go with the positive path the first time, right? It's like, I heard someone told me, I can't remember who it was like, the first time the player is going through the game, they're playing in something they know there's an interactive narrative, they're playing as themselves, and the second time they're playing as the opposite of themselves, which is interesting because the first time, they're getting a more honest experience of what they would do, and the second time they're doing everything they don't want to do. So that's kind of like not great, where it's like, I don't want to play a game and just go against the opposite of everything that I would prefer to do. So I prefer, my personal take is like having karma systems that are more gray. It's less like labeled what the good and bad choice is, and you have to think about it a little more. I mean, that's my personal taste. Obviously, lots of different opinions on how to do that. But yeah, I haven't seen, I remember on The Suffering, we thought everyone was going to play it evil. We were certain. And then we found just from like feedback, reading forums, and post-release stuff that almost everyone did good first. So that was sort of interesting. Like, players aren't as evil as you think.
That is a ray of hope.
Oh, I think they turned off your mic.
That is a ray of hope.
What's that?
That is a ray of hope.
Right, exactly. All right, I think we're out of time. Thanks, everybody.